Once you know how to sew up a basic t-shirt like this, it's really quick and easy to make one. I'm Ali and I'm going to show you how I made this basic t-shirt. I'll show you how I made the pattern from a block that I made in a previous tutorial, and I'll show you how to cut it all out, what to think about with the fabric and how to sew it up. So this is the third in a series of 3 tutorials. The first one shows you all the different ways of sewing with this fabric. So if you haven't sewn with jersey before, it might be a bit intimidating if you don't know how to use it. It is quite different to sewing wovens, but once you know the right stitches and what kind of needle to use, it's absolutely fine to sew. So in this tutorial, I'm going to make this t-shirt using my cover stitch machine and my overlocker. If you don't have those machines, then do have a look at my jersey sewing tutorial, because I show you how to sew this kind of fabric on a regular sewing machine. There's alternatives to everything I show in this tutorial. And then the second video was how to draft the block, which is what I made this pattern from. So in a second, I'm going to show you how to take that block and where to add the hem and the seam allowance, and then how to do the neck trim, which is one of the key things. It's so easy to do. The pattern is really quick to draft from the block. Even if you don't have a block and you want to just trace around your t-shirt, I'll show you what to think about when doing the neck trim. So before you get started, just make sure you have the right fabric. You want to have a little bit of stretch in your jersey fabric, and make sure that stretch goes across. If you've got a 4-way stretch, then it's going to go up and down as well. Just make sure it doesn't stretch so much that your t-shirt gets longer as you wear it. And definitely pre-wash your fabric. Jerseys do shrink a lot more than woven fabrics, so you want to make sure this isn't going to shrink once you have made it and you start wearing it and washing it. When you work with jersey, when you make something like this, you sew it in a slightly different order. You don't do the shoulders and the side seams and then put the sleeve in. What you tend to do is the shoulders, then put the sleeves in while it's flat, and then do this side seam and down the sleeve all in one go. So I'll show you in a second what order to put it all together. On this version, I did my neck trim straight after doing my shoulder seams. Sometimes I do the neck trim at the end. The reason I did it like this in this tutorial is because I didn't have enough reels of yellow thread to set up both machines, and it made sense to do all the overlocking and then the cover stitch. If you want to do it the other way around, it doesn't matter at all. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how to make the pattern. So this is a t-shirt that you would have seen me wearing in the previous videos if you've watched those, and I'm going to refer to this when showing you the seam allowances and the hem allowances and explaining how to do this neck trim. So to start with, I've traced around my block that I drafted in the previous tutorial, and I'll show you now how to turn that into a t-shirt pattern. To start with, I've traced off my block. So this is from my t-shirt block tutorial, and it's exactly as it is as I made it on the tutorial, and this is exactly how I want it to fit. So I've got my front and my back and my sleeve, and then I've just labelled on my sleeve the back, the front, and this is the notch where it matches up to the shoulder seam at the top. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to smooth this off a little bit on the side seam, because I don't want it to be quite as shaped as that in the waist. I'm only going to change it very, very slightly, and I'm just going to draw it freehand just to take a little bit of that waist shaping out, so it's not quite as shaped at the side. So that's the first little bit done, and other than adding the seam and the hem allowances, the only thing I really need to do is the neck trim. So I'm going to put my sleeve aside for a second, and what I'm going to do on my front and back, I'm going to draw on here where the neck trim is going to sit. So if we have a look at this t-shirt, this edge here around the top is basically where this is on my block. What I want to do is draw where this seam line is here, and then I can just rub this bit out here and put my seam allowances on, and then I'm going to draw a separate piece for my neck trim, which is basically just straight. If I flatten that out, it's just a piece of rectangular fabric folded in half, and it needs to be stretched on to here. So let's just do that one step at a time. The first thing I'm going to do, let's just zoom in a little bit for this. I am going to just draw on here the depth of that trim, which is 1.7 centimetres, and I'm just going to do that on the front and the back for the whole of that neck. So that's the neck done, front and back, and I need to make a note of a few measurements. So The depth of this is 1.7 centimetres. And then I need to measure around the front curve and around the back, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put notches on my pattern for my trim so that it's really easy to match this up perfectly. So the best way to measure a curve is just to put your tape measure on, try not to get my hands in the way, is to put your tape measure on like this and follow the curve round and take the measurement like that. So for my front, I'm just going right up to this edge. You're not measuring on the seam, you're measuring on the actual edge. And that for me measures 12.5 centimetres. So that's the front. And I'm just going to do exactly the same for the back. So my back is 8.5, and it's not surprising the front's a lot bigger than the back because it goes much lower down. So those are the measurements that I need for when I draw my trim in a minute. So I just need to make sure when I cut my pieces out, I don't throw that away. So now that I've drawn that on, I'm going to rub this line out and just keep my new position. So these are the shapes now of my front and my back panels. So all I need to do now with these is just draw on all the seam allowances and the hems at the bottom. So I won't make you watch me do that. I'm going to add 2 centimetres on the bottom for the hem, and I'm going to add 7mm on for all of my seams. I'm going to be sewing everything with an overlocker, and the seams are pretty small, so just work out what kind of seams you're doing and put your seam allowance on accordingly. And then on the sleeve, I'm just doing exactly the same. A seam allowance of 7 around the top and on this side seam, and 2 centimetres at the bottom, and make sure you have got that at the top to match it up to the shoulder. It just makes it a lot easier when you're putting your sleeves in. So I'm going to do that and then cut it out, and then we can have a look at drawing the neck trim. So that's the front and back done. They've got all the seam allowances and the hem, and the same on the sleeve. So the last bit is the neck trim, which is really easy. So let's just look back at the t-shirt for a second. So basically what you've got is a piece that is folded on the edge, and then you've got your seam allowance there. So the whole thing is doubled over. And what I tend to do is put notches on the centre back and the centre front and on the shoulders, and then you can make sure when you ease it on, you get it eased on properly. What you don't want to do is end up easing it on more one side than the other, and then your centre front pieces don't match up, and then you end up with a neck that just doesn't sit straight. So that is the purpose of that. So I've kept my measurements from my pattern, so I'll show you now how to draw this up. It's just a rectangle, but you just need to make sure you get those measurements 100% accurate. So what I'm going to do, I've drawn the top line. I need to work out the total depth. So the depth that you see is 1.7 centimetres, and then my seam allowance is 0.7 centimetres. So that's the total, and then obviously it's folded over, so I need to times that by 2. So the total depth is 4.8 centimetres. So I hope that makes sense what I just did. It's basically the depth plus the seam allowance, and then multiply those added together by 2. It will make sense when you start doing it, because it is, oops, and there I go, pressing too hard and ripping my paper and going through to the table. So basically these are the cut edges, and then my seam allowance is about here, and then the halfway point there, that's the actual edge. So if I just show you again with the t-shirt, basically I've put these lines on here, so you've got the seam allowance either side, and that marks where it folds. So if I look at the inside of the t-shirt, if I put that there, you can see that's the folded edge, that's the stitch line where that is, and that's where it's cut. I hope that makes sense. So those are all the lines. You don't need to draw those on, you just need to make sure the total is correct. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the whole thing as one piece. I'm not cutting this out on the fold, so I'm going to start from one end. So the first thing I'm going to do is just draw my seam allowance on that end, because I obviously need to seam this somewhere. So you can seam yours at the centre back. I tend to just put it on a shoulder seam because I think it's more discreet. I don't really want to seam at the back on this. And when it's matching up with the shoulder, you don't really notice it's there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my back measurement, which is 8.5 centimetres, which was the measurement of the top before I cut the trim depth off. So I'm going to measure 8.5 centimetres down here, and I'm going to do it on both sides because I'm going to be cutting notches on this for matching it up. So that's one back piece. So this is now the centre back, and then I'm going to measure the same again from there. I've just zoomed in because I realised I was zoomed out quite a bit. So we've got the seam allowance, and then I've measured this back measurement to the centre back, and then again, and this is now the shoulder point. And then you've probably guessed what I'm going to do. The front measurement, I am going to measure from there, and I'm going to do that twice. And those are the 2 halves of my front. So this is my centre front, and then this is the other side, which is going to join to here. So that needs my seam allowance as well. And then all I'm going to do is just mark those points down there because I need to do my notches, and that's it. That's the neck trim done. So as I said, it folds in half here. You've got the seam allowance top and bottom and either end, and that's the centre front point and the centre back point and the shoulder. And I'm going to do little snips there because it's going to be a lot easier to get on. So I'm now going to cut that out, and that's my pattern done. That's the pattern all now made. Let's get on with making the t-shirt. So that's all my pieces now. I need to cut my centre front and centre back out, just one of each on the fold, and then 2 sleeves and 1 neck piece. So this is my fabric. This is a basic cotton jersey fabric. It's a 2-way stretch, which means it just stretches across, so across the body. It doesn't stretch this way. If you have a 4-way stretch knitted fabric, which stretches that way as well, your garment could grow in length. So just bear that in mind. So assuming you're using a standard jersey fabric that stretches this way, this is the direction you want it. And for my front and back, I'm just going to fold it and cut it like this. So if I just lay my piece on here, so my back and my front are in one piece. And then for my sleeves, I'm going to have this just folded over so that my sleeves are mirror images. You don't want them cut exactly the same because the front and back slope should be very slightly different. And then for my neck trim, I just need to cut one piece out, and I need to make sure it's going in this direction because I want my stretch going that way. If you're short on fabric, don't be tempted to cut it that way because it's not going to stretch going over your head, and it's not going to look or fit great. So I'm going to get all of these pieces cut out now, and then we can sew it together, which is a pretty quick process. That's all of my pieces cut out. So obviously the seam allowances are all on there, so they're cut out literally the same as the paper. And then what I've done, where I want to notch it, which is the top of the sleeve where it hits the shoulder seam, and the centre front and the centre back points, which is where I'm going to line it up with my neck trim, I've put a tailor's tack, because the seam allowance is so small. If I snip into that, it's going to get a little bit too close to the seam line. So I've left one to do so I can show you what I mean. And they take seconds. And it just means that rather than slipping into it, you've got this little thread. So this is the last one to do. So I just need to line it up with that little line there. And I'm just going to put the needle through. And then you don't want to put a knot on the end of it or anything, just leave a little bit hanging off, and then do it again and then pull it through, and that's it. And the reason I go through twice is because if you accidentally pull it, it's not going to come out. You've got that loop that will stop it from coming out. So that's all of my pieces cut out, and all of the balance points or notches, whatever you want to call them, all marked, so I can take my pattern pieces off and start putting this together. The only other thing you might want to do is just mark on your sleeve which is the front and which is the back, because it's going to look the same once you take it off. And all I usually do is I just put a pin in the back, and because I do it every time I do a sleeve, I know that the pin marks the back. So I am going to start by joining these two pieces together on the shoulder. So this is my front and my back. So the back's the one with the straighter neckline, and all I'm doing is putting the right sides together and joining the shoulders. So make sure you have definitely got the right sides, because Sewing this kind of fabric is not great to unpick. If you're overlocking it, it takes ages. If you're doing some kind of stretch stitch, some of those stitches on a regular sewing machine aren't the best for unpicking. So just make sure you've definitely got this right, and you can either pin or clip your shoulder seams together. And just make sure they're lined up perfectly at the neck. You're going to have a little tiny overlap there where the neck shape is. So I've got these pinned together. I'm now going to get my overlocker set up to sew these, and I'm going to do a little test piece first to make sure all my tension, stitch length, everything like that is perfect. If you don't have an overlocker, as I said at the beginning, I have a separate video that shows you different stretch stitches that you can use for this. And then one other thing I would say for the shoulder is, with this kind of t-shirt weight fabric, this is absolutely fine, but if you've got a really lightweight fabric that's likely to stretch over time, a stretchable tape is great to sew on this at the same time. You can either sew it on after you've done the seam or sew it on at the same time, but it must have stretch. You don't want to use anything rigid on this. So I've got my overlocker all threaded up, and I've done a little test piece just to make sure the stitch has the right tension, all of that stuff. So I'm ready to start sewing. I don't want to have any chance that this isn't right before I sew my actual t-shirt. So I'm going to start with the shoulders that I've pinned, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to lift the foot up because I don't want anything slipping by getting knocked by pins or anything. So I'm just lifting that up and getting that to the starting position. And then I just want to make sure as I sew it that I don't accidentally stretch anything. You want the machine to feed it through. You don't want to be pulling it from the back. You don't want to be accidentally holding it at the front. You don't want anything stretching. And that's the first shoulder seam done. It's as simple as that. So I'm just going to do exactly the same with the other shoulder and give them a good press towards the back. That's the first bit of the t-shirt now sewn up, and I'm going to do the neck trim next. You don't have to do this. You can do the neck trim at the end if you want, but I'm going to do all of the sewing on my overlocker and then all of the sewing on my cover stitch after, so I can reuse the threads. I don't have enough threads for everything. So the next thing is to get this neck trim ready to go on. This is the back and this is the front, and then this is the shoulder seam. So obviously the back is a lot smaller than the front, but this is because the neck comes down a lot more at the front. So I've got all of these points marked, so I can take my pins out. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to iron this down the middle, because it's much easier to find where the middle is when it's just flat like this. So where I've put the stitches, they match up, so you can make sure you don't get it twisted by matching those. And then obviously the ends just fold over. So before I do anything else, I'm just going to give this a press to mark a crease down the middle. And now that I've got this pressed down the middle, I need to join my ends. So I'm just going to open it up. I'm just going to be careful not to knock out those threads. I can see one little bit's come out already, but there's still plenty in there. So I'm just going to put right sides together and join this up. I'm going to be putting it on as a finished trim. So I'm just going to sew this together on my overlocker, just how I did the shoulder seams, or you can just do any kind of stretch stitch on a regular machine. And then I'm going to press that towards the back. So just make sure you know which is the back. So I can see that these notches are closer together. So that's my back. So I'm just going to press it in that direction, and then I'll start pinning it onto my neck. So what I have ultimately is the front there. I've got this little seam here that sits where the shoulder seam is. You can have it at the back if you want, but I prefer it at the side because I think it's a little bit more subtle. So all of these points here match up with these. It might look like the trim is too small, but you've got to remember that this folded edge at the top is where the opening is, and the bit here needs to be stretched on where the seam is to fit this. So if I just lay this here, it looks like it's too short, but it's going to be stretched on. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to put some pins in it just to hold this together where the cut edge is before I go any further. So I've got that now pinned, and this is in the right position. So there's my centre front notch, centre back, the seam marks that one, and then the notch for this one. So this all needs to go on with the right sides together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work from the other side. I want my trim underneath and my t-shirt fabric on top, just because this is heavier than this. It's just the way I like to do it. So I know that's the right size together, so I'm just going to put this pin in there temporarily so I don't get confused when I turn it around. So now that I've got this inside out with the right size together, I'm just going to take that out because I know these need to match up, and I need to match where these orange stitches are perfectly. And I'm going to put a pin in this direction, and then I can pull all of those out. I don't need those anymore. And I'm going to do exactly the same on the shoulders and the centre back. So on this one, rather than the orange thread, I just match it up to where the shoulder seam is. So I'm just going to get all of those done. Now that all 4 points are marked on, and I've got it like this with the right sides facing each other, you can see that you really do have to stretch that to fit to this. So let's do one little section at a time, because you want to make sure that this is eased on nice and evenly. So I'm just going to pull it out until it fits on like this, and then I'm just going to grab a point and put a pin through. And I just need to keep doing that. Don't worry that this looks a little bit puckered like this, because this is all going to be steamed into shape in a minute. So that's one section done, and I just need to pull it like this as I sew it on. So I'm going to get all 4 sections pinned on. This is how it should look once it's on. So unlike any of the other bits, it is going to look puckered, because what I'm going to do in a minute is I'm going to steam it, and that's going to put that all into shape. I want this to be the right size. If I made the stitch line to be the right size, this would then be too big. So it'll be steamed into place, and then when I get my cover stitch machine out in a minute, I'm going to also do some top stitching around here. So I'm going to get this overlocked on now. All I need to do now is just sew this all on in one go. So if you're not using an overlocker, if you're doing a stretch stitch, you might need to just sew it and then go back and do an overlock stitch on a regular machine. But if you're using an overlocker, this is all done in one go. So I've got the t-shirt on the top and the trim underneath, and I need to make sure I go through all 3 layers. So I'm not going to film this as I sew it, because I need to get nice and close to make sure I do a good job, and I can't do that with my tripod in the way. I can hardly get to my sewing machine. So all I'll do is just lower the foot on there to make sure this is lined up perfectly, and just sew all the way around exactly the same way as I did the shoulders, making sure I don't stretch anything as I do it, but I need to stretch it just enough that this sews perfectly. But by putting the pins in, I've already kind of stretched that into place anyway. All I'm doing is stretching the trim to fit the actual neck piece. So I'll get that sewn on now, and I'll show you once I've sewn it on before I give it a press. And this is how it looks straight off the machine. So that's how it should look. This will naturally go towards the actual body of the t-shirt rather than the top, just because it's heavier. So it should naturally sit in that direction. So all I'm going to do now is give this a really good steam to hold that in place, and you can just leave it at that if you want to, but what I'm going to do when I get my cover stitch machine out in a minute is I'm going to do just a single row on the cover stitch machine, which will give it some stretch, which will help that stay in place, because as I wear it and wash it, I don't want to have to iron this back in place every time I wash it. I plan on wearing this a lot, and it'll go through the washing machine a lot of times. So I'm going to do that in a minute when I do my hems, because I want to do it all in one go. So hopefully this is how yours is looking at this stage. So I'm just going to go and give it a steam, and then we can move on to getting the sleeves in and the side seams sewn up and making this a whole t-shirt. So that's how it looks now that it's had a press. It looks a little bit better, and then once I put my stitching on in a minute, it's going to hold it all in place permanently. It's bits like that that would bother me. So you could do any kind of decorative stitch holding that down, particularly on the back. Basically, as long as the stitch isn't straight, it's going to stretch. If it's got a little zigzag or something, it gives it a bit of stretch. So let's leave it at that for now, and I'm going to get my sleeves on. So I'll zoom back out again, and I will show you how to do the sleeves. First thing I'm going to do is separate these. So I'm just going to pull them open, and the reason I do this quite big is because actually if I snip that now, I've got something marking both sides. So my pin marks my back, so I need to make sure I get it in the right place. So you can see straight away this is the back, because it's the neck with the straighter bit. So it goes this side, and make sure you've got right sides together. So if I go like that, that's my sleeve on that side and all the right sides are facing up. So that nothing gets confused, I'm just gonna pin that on there like that, so I know that's where that one goes, while I go to the other side and start putting this one on. So I've got my mark here, and that means that needs to match up there. So whether you've done a snip or however you've done it, that needs to basically line up with the shoulder. And then this needs to line up here. And the same on the other side. So don't be tempted to sew this up like you would have woven and do the side seams and then put the sleeve in as one piece. On knits, they are generally sewn up like this. You haven't got to ease the sleeve on. Your sleeve seams should be absolutely identical if your pattern is correct. So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pin this on, and it should pin on really easily because these seams, as I said, are exactly the same size. So I won't make you watch me pinning all this on, but I'm going to get both sleeves now pinned on, ready to sew on. That's both of my sleeves now pinned on, so that's how it should look. It doesn't need to be eased on, as I said, that pinned on nice and easily. So I've got both of those pinned on. If I just flip that around, we can look at the whole t-shirt shape from the inside, so you can see it's starting to look like a t-shirt. So I'm just going to get these now sewn on. I'm just going to overlock them on exactly the same way as I have overlocked everything else. So I'm going to get those done, and then I'm going to press everything towards the neck before I do my side seams. That's now stitched and pressed, and it's really starting to look like a t-shirt. So I'm going to go back inside and put my right sides together, and the last bit of assembling it is just to do this side seam, which is really self-explanatory. So I just need to make sure it matches up at the bottom, and then it matches up at the bottom of the sleeve, and then the other place to make sure it matches is at the armhole. And this is why I press my sleeves first. It's going to be tricky to press them after, so make sure when you're sewing this that your seams are pressed towards the body part of your t-shirt. So I'm just going to put a few more pins in between. It's rolling a little bit, so I'm going to make sure that that roll is flattened out when I'm pinning it. And again, this doesn't require any easing, so it should be nice and easy. So all I'm going to do is sew this in one continuous seam down here. So I'll get both sides pinned and overlocked, and then I'm going to press everything on the body and the sleeve towards the back of my t-shirt, and then the actual shape is fully assembled. The last thing I need to do now is just hem the sleeves and the bottom, and then I'm going to do a single needle cover stitch around the neck. So I've just played around with my cover stitch machine to make sure I've got this right. So I'm going to do a stitch that encases the hem. So I'm going to fold this exactly 2 centimeters and line it up on the machine, and that's the look you get when it's the seam allowance is all perfectly encased within that stitching. So I'm going to get everything now pinned up on my t-shirt, both sleeves and the bottom, 2 centimeters. So I'm just going to fold it up and measure it, but I need to pin it from the right side. If you haven't got a cover stitch machine, then check out my sewing jersey tutorial, which will show you alternatives that you can do on any basic machine. Everything's now pinned, ready to sew. So I've got 2 centimeters folded up, and I've pinned it from the right side on the sleeves and the hem, and I just need to now get my cover stitch machine and sew all of this up with the twin needle. So it's all now set up. I've got the 2 needles on the wider setting, and I've got this little hem guide on here, so it's lined up perfectly. So it's 2 centimeters from the edge of this to my needle on the left, which means that all my seam allowance will be encased in the hem. So let's just zoom out a little bit, and all I need to do is literally just line my edge up. I'm not going to actually sew it now because I want to get nice and close, but I'm lining it up with this, and I just need to take my time sewing it, making sure that this doesn't curl underneath, because if it doesn't, then it's going to be perfectly encased in that. If it curls, it might miss it. So I need to just take my pins out as I sew along. And as I said, I'm not gonna film it while I'm sewing it because I want to move my camera so that I can get really close and make sure this is perfectly lined up. I don't want this to move around here. I want it to be sewn nice and slow so I have a perfect hem. So I'm going to do that on all 3 hems, and then I'm going to take one of the needles out to finish off the neck. So let's get these hems done first. So I've got a little bit of this sewn, and I just wanted to show while it's on the machine. You can see there now, if I fold that back, that's the bit that I've sewn, and it is lined up perfectly, which is what you want. It's just a case of making sure when you set it up that these distances are perfect and what you've pinned is perfect. And if you do all of that and you don't stretch it as you sew it, you'll have a perfect jersey hem. That's all of the hems now done. So I've got a nice neat hem on my sleeves and at the bottom, and on the inside it looks perfect too. So the very last thing I'm going to do is take one of those needles out and just do a single row around here. I've zoomed right in now to show you what I'm doing. So I'm going to sew a single needle on the cover stitch, which is a chain stitch. So I've played around with this with some scraps of fabric just to get it exactly how I want it. So what I'm doing is I've got my needle in the middle position. There's 3 needle positions and I'm using it in the middle, and that means if I just get something to point with it, with these little bits here, I'm lining up this seam here with this, and it means that if I sew nice and slowly and I keep that in that same position, then my stitching is going to be nice and even. So I'll show you this as well because I always like to show my mistakes. This is where I've already sewn it and it looked a real mess. My stitch size was too small and I didn't keep it nice and straight because I tried to film it as I was sewing it. So I have taken that row out. The good thing with a chain stitch is it's really easy to unravel. So I'm going to do this again, and I'm not going to film it this time because I want it to be lovely and straight. So on my cover stitch machine, I've got tension of 4 on the looper underneath and the needle tension dial on the top, and my stitch length is 2.5. So I'm just gonna hand wind it so you can see slowly what's going on. So I'm just lining that up with that, and that's where it then hits. And I'm just going to take my time sewing all the way around, making sure it's perfectly lined up, because this is the bit that you're going to see more than anything, and I want it to be perfect. I don't have to be unraveling a chain stitch for the second time. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sew all the way around, and then my t-shirt is complete. And I'm really glad I unpicked it. This now looks so much better. So it just finishes that off. You don't have to do it. You can have it just pressed if you want, or often on shop bought t-shirts, you'll see that it's just stitched on the back, but it helps hold this down. So as you launder it and as you wear it, it just keeps it all in place. And I think it just finishes it off. So the other option you can do is do some kind of decorative stitch around there, contrast thread, any of those things. So let's see if I can zoom out. I can a little bit. So that is now my finished t-shirt, all completed. Hopefully I've covered everything that you need to know, and if there's anything I haven't, then please ask in the comments below. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and you are now feeling like having a go at making your own t-shirt. They honestly get quicker and easier every time you do them. They're pretty basic and pretty quick to sew up. So if you've enjoyed this video, do check out my other t-shirt tutorials if you've not seen them yet, and check out all the other tutorials that I've got that covers everything from drafting patterns to sewing techniques to whole projects. Please like this video as it helps me grow my channel, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of my future tutorials.